It was the day I buried Richard, my husband of 43 years, when I found the letter. After the funeral, our home felt unbearably empty. I wandered from room to room, touching the things he'd left behind. His reading glasses on the nightstand, the half-empty coffee mug he'd never finish. Each object held a memory, a fragment of our life together. I don't know what drew me to his closet that night. Perhaps I needed to breathe in his scent once more, to run my fingers across the fabric of his clothes. His suits hung in a neat row. Richard had always been so particular about his appearance. I pulled his favorite navy suit forward, the one he wore to our daughter's wedding. My fingers brushed against something in the inner pocket, a folded envelope yellowed with age. The handwriting wasn't mine. The letter was addressed simply to "My dearest." My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. "My dearest," it began. "I don't know how to tell Emma and David that their father won't be coming home this weekend either. They're growing so fast and you're missing it all. I know your work in Boston is important, but we need you here in Denver too. We miss you. Miss you. Please find a way to come home to us soon. All my love, Sarah." The date at the top of the letter was from 15 years ago. Emma, David, Denver. My husband had never mentioned these names, and as far as I knew, he'd never lived in Denver. His business trips had taken him all over the country, but the realization hit me like a physical blow. I had to clutch the door frame to keep from falling. Richard hadn't just been traveling for business all those years. He had another family, another life, halfway across the country. My legs gave way as I sank to the floor, still clutching the letter. How could this be real? The man who'd kissed me goodbye every Monday morning, who'd called me every night when he was away, who'd raised our son and walked our daughter down the aisle. How could he have been living such a profound lie? I spent that night surrounded by his suits, pulling out every pocket, checking every fold. By dawn, I had found 3 more letters, all from Sarah, spanning nearly 20 years. And a small photo, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, standing between 2 teenagers. On the back, written in Richard's familiar script, "My Denver Treasures 2018. For 43 years, I thought I knew every inch of Richard Wilson's heart. Now, sitting among the fragments of our shattered life, I realized I might have never known him at all." Chapter 2. The Decision. The week after the funeral passed in a blur. Friends brought casseroles I couldn't eat. My son James called daily from Seattle, worried about me being alone. My daughter Lisa stopped by with her children, filling the house with noise that should have been comforting but only highlighted the hollow space Richard had left behind. No one knew what I'd discovered. I couldn't bring myself to tell them, to tarnish their memories of their father. But the truth was consuming me from within. I found myself staring at the photo for hours. Emma and David, Richard's other children. Were they grieving too? Did they even know he was gone? Had Sarah known about me, about our children? The questions circled endlessly, robbing me of sleep. One night, after tossing and turning until 3 a.m., I made a decision. I needed answers. I needed to know the full truth, even if it destroyed what was left of my heart. I would go to Denver. I told James and Lisa I needed some time away to process my grief. They were concerned but supportive. After all, what could happen to a 68-year-old widow taking a short trip to clear her head? What indeed? As I packed my suitcase, I slipped the letters and the photo into my purse. The address on the most recent letter was from 5 years ago. Would they still be there? Would I have the courage to knock on their door if they were? On the flight to Denver, I rehearsed what I might say. "Hello, I'm Martha Wilson. I believe my husband was also your..." "What? Husband? Father?" The words stuck in my throat, even in rehearsal. The rental car company gave me a sleek silver sedan that Richard would have appreciated. As I programmed the address into the GPS, my finger hovered over the screen. I could still turn back, preserve what was left of my memories, my marriage. But living with half-truths had never been my way. I pressed Start Navigation and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the life Richard had hidden from me for decades. Chapter 3. The Other House. The neighborhood was pleasant. Neat lawns, mature trees, children's bicycles leaning against fences. It wasn't so different from our own suburb back in Massachusetts. I don't know what I'd expected. Something seedier perhaps, something that would have explained why Richard had kept this life separate. But this was a place where families grew, where people put down roots. I parked across the street from the address on the letters. It was a 2-story craftsman with blue shutters and a wide front porch. Wind chimes tinkled softly in the autumn breeze. A silver SUV sat in the driveway. For 20 minutes, I sat frozen behind the wheel watching the house. What was I doing here? What right did I have to disrupt these people's lives? They were grieving too, surely. Or maybe they weren't. Maybe Richard had abandoned them years ago. As I debated with myself, the front door opened. A woman stepped out onto the porch. Even from a distance, I recognized her from the photograph. Sarah. She was older now, probably in her early 60s, her blonde hair streaked with gray, but she moved with a grace that made my heart ache. She bent to water potted plants on the porch steps, seemingly at peace with the world. I watched her for a few minutes. This woman who had shared my husband. Not with malice, but with curiosity. Had she known about me? Had she been deceived as well? Before I could lose my nerve, I stepped out of the car. My legs felt unsteady as I crossed the street, but I forced myself forward. Sarah looked up as I approached, a polite smile forming on her lips, the kind you give to strangers. "Can I help you?" she asked. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out the photo, turning it so she could see. Her smile froze, then faded. She looked from the picture to my face, confusion giving way to something else. Recognition. "You're Martha," she said softly, not a question but a statement of fact. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "You know who I am." Sarah nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I've known about you for a long time." She glanced back at the house, then turned to me. "You better come inside. There's a lot we need to talk about." I followed her into the home Richard had shared with her, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. What truths awaited me inside those walls? And was I strong enough to hear them? Chapter 4. The Truth Unfolds. Sarah's living room was cozy, filled with books and family photos. I couldn't help but scan them as I sat rigidly on the edge of a floral armchair. Richard's face smiled back at me from dozens of frames. Richard at a graduation, Richard on a camping trip, Richard carving a Thanksgiving turkey. A parallel life, identical in its domesticity to the one he'd shared with me. "Coffee," Sarah offered, her hands trembling slightly as she set down a tray. "How long have you known about me?" I asked, ignoring the offer. I hadn't come for pleasantries. Sarah sank into the sofa across from me. 15 years, she said quietly. I found out when Emma was in high school. She needed his social security number for a college application, and I went through his papers while he was with you, I guess. She took a deep breath. I found documents with your name, your address in Boston. It didn't take much to piece it together. And you stayed with him. I couldn't keep the incredulity from my voice. I confronted him, of course, Sarah said, looking down at her hands. He broke down, told me everything. How he'd met you first, married you, had your children. Then his company sent him to Denver for what was supposed to be a 6-month project. He met me and... She trailed off. And he didn't have the decency to divorce me before starting another family. I finished for her, bitterness edging my words. To my surprise, Sarah looked up with fire in her eyes. Do you think it was simple for him? He loved both families. He couldn't bear to lose either one. So instead he lived a lie. 2 lies. Yes, she admitted. But after I found out, we tried to make it right. He was going to tell you, Martha. He was finally going to end the deception. When? I demanded. When exactly was he planning to tell me that our entire marriage was built on lies? Sarah's expression softened with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. After his retirement next year. We had it all planned. He was going to come clean to both families, try to bring everyone together somehow. I laughed, a harsh sound that scraped my throat. And you believed that would work? That his children, all of his children, would forgive such a betrayal? I don't know, Sarah admitted. But it was better than continuing the lie. The heart attack. It came before he could make things right. We sat in silence for a long moment, two women bound by love for the same man, by the same grief, the same betrayal. Did you have a funeral? Finally asked. Sarah nodded. Last week. Small, just family. Emma and David are devastated. They idolized their father. So did my James and Lisa, I said softly. The common ground between us was strange and painful. Would you like to see some photos? Sarah asked hesitantly. Of their growing up years, I mean. The parts of Richard's life you missed. I almost refused, but something made me nod. Perhaps it was the desire to know the complete man, not just the husband I thought I'd had. Sarah brought over photo albums, and together we pieced together the life of Richard Wilson. The full, complicated, duplicitous life he had built across two cities, with two women who had loved him completely. As the afternoon light faded into evening, I realized I had one more question. Perhaps the most important one. Did he love me? Asked, my voice small. Really love me? Or was I just the obligation he couldn't escape? Sarah looked at me for a long moment before answering. Martha, I asked him the same question about me. That day I confronted him. She reached over and squeezed my hand. The first physical contact between us. He told me something I've held on to ever since. He said, the human heart isn't limited like our time or our lives. Love doesn't divide when shared. It multiplies. I believe he loved us both fully and completely, in his own flawed way. I wasn't sure if her words brought comfort or deeper pain. But as I stood to leave, I knew one thing with certainty. The Richard I was mourning had never really existed. The man who had lived between two worlds was a stranger to us both. Chapter 5, The Box. I spent the night in a hotel, too emotionally exhausted to drive. Sarah had offered her guest room. An absurd kindness I couldn't accept. We had exchanged phone numbers, though. For what purpose I wasn't entirely sure. In the sterile hotel room, I lay awake replaying our conversation. Sarah had told me that after she discovered the truth, she and Richard had established new boundaries. He would spend 2 weeks with each family, claiming extended business trips to the other. Holidays were carefully negotiated. The deception had become more organized, more intentional, and somehow that felt worse than the original betrayal. The next morning Sarah called. There's something else, she said, her voice hesitant. Something you should see before you leave Denver. I agreed to meet her, curiosity overcoming my reluctance. She picked me up at the hotel, and we drove in uncomfortable silence to a storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Richard rented this unit 10 years ago, she explained as we walked down a row of metal doors. I only found out about it after his death. The facility manager called about the autopay from his credit card. She unlocked Unit 247 and rolled up the door. Inside was a single item. A large wooden chest, beautifully crafted, with intricate carvings across its surface. I haven't opened it, Sarah said. I was waiting. I think I was waiting for you. Together we knelt beside the chest. The key was taped to the underside of the lid, where Richard knew we would look. He had used the same hiding place for spare keys at both homes. Inside the chest were dozens of journals, meticulously dated, spanning over 40 years. And beneath them, neatly organized folders with labels that made my breath catch. For Martha, for Sarah, for James and Lisa, for Emma and David. He was preparing, Sarah whispered, for when he would finally tell the truth. We spent hours in that storage unit, reading Richard's private thoughts, his explanations, his apologies. In his journals, he agonized over his choices, documented his love for both families, and outlined his plan to eventually merge his two worlds, a plan interrupted by his sudden death. The folder marked "For Martha" contained a 20-page letter, written in Richard's precise handwriting. I couldn't bring myself to read it there, under Sarah's watchful eye. I tucked it into my purse for later, when I was alone. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked as we closed the chest. "Do we tell the children?" It was the question I had been wrestling with since finding that first letter. Did James and Lisa deserve to know the truth about their father? Would it serve any purpose beyond causing them pain? "I don't know," I admitted. "What good would come of it?" "Honesty," Sarah said simply. "Finally, after all these years." We agreed to take some time to decide, to read everything Richard had left behind before making any decisions that would affect so many lives. As Sarah drove me back to my hotel, she asked, "Will you keep in touch, Martha? Let me know what you decide about telling your children." I looked at this woman, my husband's other wife, and felt a strange connection. We were the only two people who truly understood what the other had lost, what the other was going through. "Yes," I said. "I will." Chapter 6. The Choice. Back in my empty house in Boston, I finally found the courage to read Richard's letter. I poured a glass of wine, settled into his favorite chair, and unfolded the pages that represented his final words to me. "My dearest Martha," it began. "By the time you read this, you will know the truth about the life I've led, the lies I've told. There is no explanation I can offer that will justify what I've done, but I owe you the attempt." He wrote of our early years together, the genuine love he felt, the joy our children brought him. He described the loneliness of his assignment in Denver, how meeting Sarah had been unplanned, unexpected, how one lie had led to another, until he was trapped in an impossible situation of his own making. "I convinced myself that maintaining both families was the kindest choice," he wrote. "That breaking either of your hearts was a cruelty I couldn't bear to inflict. Only later did I recognize this for the cowardice it was." The letter ended with his plan, how after his retirement, he intended to confess everything, to try to build some kind of blended family from the wreckage of his deception. A naive hope, perhaps, but one he had clung to. "I don't ask for forgiveness, Martha, only understanding. The man you loved existed. He was real. That part was never a lie. I loved you completely even while loving Sarah. If that seems impossible to believe, I can only say that the heart doesn't follow logical rules. My greatest regret is the pain I know this revelation will cause you. You deserved so much better than the husband I was." I sat with the letter in my lap long after I'd finished reading, tears tracking silently down my cheeks. Not just for what I had lost, but for what might have been if Richard had found the courage to be honest sooner. The next day I called Sarah. "I've made a decision," I told her. "I'm going to tell my children the truth." "Are you sure?" she asked. "It will change how they remember him forever. They deserve to know their whole father," I said firmly. "The man who loved them and made mistakes. The complicated, flawed human being. Not the perfect dad they've put on a pedestal." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I'll tell Emma and David too," she finally said. "And Martha." Richard mentioned in his journals that he set up trust funds for all 4 children. They're mentioned in his will, but not by name. Just account numbers. I think he was hoping they might meet someday. The idea was startling. "Do you think that's possible? After everything?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But they're siblings, whether they want to be or not. Half-siblings at least. Maybe someday when the anger passes." "Maybe," I agreed, though it seemed unlikely. How could our children possibly form relationships built on their father's betrayal? Yet, as I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't expected. A tiny flicker of hope. Not for forgiveness or reconciliation with Richard's memory, but for something new. A future where honesty prevailed, where the tangled web he'd woven might somehow transform into connections none of us could have imagined. I picked up the phone again to call James. It was time to start telling the truth. Chapter 7. The Unexpected Legacy. 6 months passed. The revelations went as painfully as expected. James refused to speak about his father for weeks. Lisa threw Richard's pictures into the trash, then retrieved them the next day, sobbing. Family therapy became our Sunday ritual. Sarah reported similar reactions from Emma and David. Shock, anger, grief, a second mourning, this time for the father they thought they knew. None of the children wanted to meet their half-siblings. The very suggestion was met with hostility. "They're not my family," Lisa had declared firmly. "They're just people who got caught in the same lie." I had resigned myself to this being the end of the story. Two separate families, united only by deception, moving forward on parallel paths that would never intersect. Then came the letter from Richard's attorney. It arrived simultaneously at both households. Identical envelopes with both mine and Sarah's names listed as recipients. Inside was an invitation of sorts, addressed to all 6 of us. The 2 wives and 4 children. Richard had arranged for a reading of a separate secret will, to take place exactly 6 months after his death. Attendance was optional but encouraged. The location was a private room at a resort in Colorado. Neutral territory, halfway between our worlds. "Are you going?" Sarah asked when she called. "I don't know," I admitted. "Are you?" "I think I have to," she said. "To finish this somehow." I felt the same pull, a need for final closure, to hear Richard's last words, whatever they might be. Convincing James and Lisa was another matter. They resisted, argued, refused. But curiosity is a powerful force, and in the end, they agreed to accompany me. Sarah was bringing Emma and David as well. The resort was beautiful. A serene mountain lodge far from both our everyday lives. We arrived separately, gathering awkwardly in a private dining room before the meeting with the attorney. It was surreal, watching Richard's children meet for the first time. James, tall and serious like his father, shaking hands stiffly with David, who had Richard's smile. Lisa, artistic and emotional, eyeing Emma, who shared her father's analytical mind. The physical resemblances were striking. Family traits spread across 2 families who had never known of each other's existence. "Thank you all for coming," the attorney began when we were seated. He was an elderly man, a friend of Richard's I'd never met. Richard prepared this video to be shown after his death, on the condition that both families were ready to hear it. A screen lowered from the ceiling and suddenly Richard was there before us. Healthy, alive, looking directly into the camera. My heart clenched painfully at the sight. "If you're watching this," he began, "then I'm gone and the truth has finally come out. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to tell you myself. I've spent decades living between 2 worlds, loving 2 families, and the weight of that deception has been my private burden. Now I imagine it's become yours." He spoke directly to his children, apologizing for the lies, emphasizing that his love for each of them had always been genuine, unwavering. Then he addressed Sarah and me. "Martha, Sarah, I can't ask for forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. But I hope in time you might understand that my heart belonged fully to both of you. That wasn't the lie. The lie was pretending I had to choose." The video continued with his final request. The real purpose behind gathering us all in that room. "Before you all go your separate ways, before you close the door on this chapter of our shared history, I'm asking for 1 week. 1 week together at this resort, all expenses paid. Get to know each other. Not for my sake. I've lost the right to ask anything for myself. But for yours. There's healing to be found in connection, even connections formed through pain." The screen went dark and silence filled the room. "This is absurd," James said, standing abruptly. "I'm not staying here with strangers." "We're not exactly thrilled either," Emma shot back. The attorney cleared his throat. "Mr. Wilson anticipated your reluctance. He asked me to inform you that each of you who stays the full week will receive a substantial inheritance. Money set aside separately from what was distributed in his public will. Furthermore, He's established a joint trust that will only activate if all 4 children agree to serve as co-trustees. He's trying to manipulate us from beyond the grave, David muttered. Maybe, I said, speaking up for the first time. Or maybe he's trying, in his flawed way, to create something good from his mistakes. Sarah nodded slowly. I think I'm going to stay. Not for the money, but because I'm tired of living with half-truths and divisions. I looked around at these people. This unconventional, accidental family brought together by one man's complicated life. I'll stay too, I decided. One by one, reluctantly, the children agreed as well. Some motivated by curiosity, others by the inheritance, all of them perhaps sharing an unspoken need for resolution. As we dispersed to our separate rooms that evening, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. What would this week bring? Healing? Further pain? Or something entirely unexpected? Whatever happened, for the first time since finding that letter in Richard's suit pocket, I felt like I was finally stepping onto a path forward. Not away from the past, but through it, toward something new, something honest at last. I didn't know what Richard's true legacy would be. The pain of his deception or the possibility of these new connections. But as I watched his children walking away together, already falling into cautious conversation, I allowed myself to hope it might be the latter. Sometimes it seems even the most tangled lies can lead to unexpected truths.